Hey guys, tonight we're traveling somewhere warm. Not beachy warm, not suns out, toes out. Warm, but scorched, shimmering mirage on the horizon warm. You're standing in the middle of an ancient Persian courtyard, somewhere between Yazd and the edge of the known world, and the heat is curling off the clay walls like invisible fingers. The air hums, the shadows are sharp, and you can already feel sweat prickling the back of your neck. You won't find any air conditioning units here, no chilled lemonade, no ceiling fan humming above your head. And yet, somehow it's cooler inside the thick clay walls than outside in that molten courtyard. How? That's what you're here to discover. But a warning, you probably wouldn't survive more than 20 minutes in this sun without some serious shade. These folks, they built their own. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not here for algorithms. I'm here for history, weird facts and stories that might just lull you into the best nap of your life. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You press your hand against one of those sun-baked walls. The clay is surprisingly cool. No, not just cooler than the air. Genuinely cool, as if it were storing nighttime. You blink. There's a small arched doorway ahead, leading to a shaded hall. And you step inside. This is where it begins. In ancient Persia, around the Achaemenid era, say 500 BCE or so, architecture wasn't just a matter of aesthetics, it was survival. Summers regularly pushed past 100 degrees, especially in desert regions like Yazd Kerman and Kashan. The builders of these spaces had to work with what they had: clay, mud, brick, stone, and whatever breeze they could coax from the sky. Inside this first hall, your sandals crunch on compacted earth. The air is quiet. There are no windows in sight, only slender slits carved high in the wall. And it smells faintly of sun-warmed dust herbs, and perhaps, oddly, something wet. Now here's your first soothing fact of the night. These buildings didn't just survive the heat. They played with it, manipulated it, used it. With clay walls, sometimes over 3 feet thick, homes and palaces absorbed heat during the day, then slowly exhaled it at night, like ancient breathing beings. And here's where things get a little quirky. Some rooms were deliberately buried partially underground, not just for protection, but because the earth itself is a better air conditioner than most modern ones. A well-built cellar in 6th century BCE Iran could keep wine and pomegranates fresh through the worst of summer. Historians still argue whether this was accidental discovery or a stroke of engineering brilliance passed down orally from Mesopotamian builders. One thing's certain: by the time of Darius Thurs, Persian architects were among the most climate-savvy builders the world had ever seen. But you haven't seen the real trick yet. Step forward and look up. There, reaching above the roofline like a weird chimney, is something that shouldn't be there. A tall hollow tower with open slats like a giant whistle built into the sky. You're looking at the ancestor of modern air conditioning. It's called a badger or windcatcher, but we're not ready to climb it just yet. Back here in the inner chamber, you hear something. Not a voice, not a breeze. It's the distant glug, glug, glug of water echoing through clay pipes beneath your feet. That, too, is part of the secret. You pause by a curved bench molded into the wall meant for lounging in the shade while sipping something cooling and spiced. Maybe sharbat, maybe just cold well water laced with basil. The bench is surprisingly cool. Clay does that. And as you sit, one more detail catches your eye: a cluster of clay jars nestled against the corner, faintly beading with condensation. You'll learn their secret soon enough. For now, just let your breathing slow, your shoulders drop, and imagine the world before electricity, before ice machines. And yet somehow, your ancestors knew how to sleep peacefully even under a desert sun. You're standing now at the base of a curious tower. It rises above the clay brick palace like a rigid sail frozen in time. Not ornate, not intimidating, just tall, narrow, and hollow, with open slats at the top that face the wind. This, believe it or not, is the air conditioning system of the ancient Persian world. It's called a badger or windcatcher, and it's about to become your new favorite architectural hack. See, in a place where summer temperatures could sizzle well past 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and where opening a window often meant letting in more heat, the Persians had to outthink the climate. And they did brilliantly. The badger was their signature move, an elegant blend of physics and necessity that turned harsh winds into a silky breeze flowing through every room. You step through an archway and feel it instantly, the temperature difference between the outer courtyard and the shaded hallway. It's not dramatic, just a few degrees, but in this dry heat, that shift feels like the difference between a bad idea and a tolerable one. The tower above you is catching the wind from a specific direction, channeling it downward like a whisper through stone. Some badgers were simple, just one directional opening. Others were fancier, with 4 or even 8 faces, allowing them to catch wind from any direction, like a weather vane that refuses to move. Inside the shaft, the air cools slightly as it brushes against the earthen walls, then descends like a lazy river of breeze, winding its way into the rooms below. Historians still argue whether this design was borrowed from Egypt, fine-tuned in Mesopotamia, or uniquely Persian from the start. But one thing's clear: by 400 BCE, the Achaemenid Empire had embraced the badger as standard palace gear. And it wasn't just royalty. Merchants, scholars, and even modest homes in Yazd and Bam eventually got their own versions, proving that everyone, rich or poor, gets sweaty in the desert. There's a fringe theory that badgers weren't just for cooling. Some scholars believe they doubled as natural air purifiers, helping filter out dust and even faint cooking smoke. Whether that's a stretch or just wishful thinking is still up for debate. But here's a fun detail: the best badgers had clever additions, like internal partitions to control wind flow. Think of it like ductwork before ductwork. And because the materials were mostly mud brick and plaster, the towers could be built tall without requiring stone or metal, a low-tech masterpiece of form and function. As you run your hand along the rough interior of the tower shaft, you might notice something else: moisture. In some homes, these towers were connected to underground water channels or cisterns, so the incoming air could pass over cool water first. That's right, evaporative cooling, Persian edition. And here's where the gentle sarcasm kicks in. Modern HVAC engineers might take pride in programmable thermostats and smart vents, but the ancient Persians, they cooled entire estates using nothing but wind, clay, and geometry. Try syncing that to your phone. You lean back into the draft, now letting it graze your arms and neck. It's not air-conditioned cold, but it's something deeper, natural, earned ancient. The windcatcher doesn't roar or hum. It just works silently, endlessly, as long as the wind obliges. Above you, the desert sky is fading into lavender. The slats of the badger glow with the last gold of sunlight. You pause in the stillness, realizing that long before thermostats and ceiling fans, someone stood exactly where you are, face tilted upward, marveling at a breeze that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The wind is not just welcome here, it's engineered. You follow a sloping corridor of baked clay, your sandals skimming over smooth-packed earth, until you step into a wide-open hall, lined with tall, narrow vents cut high into the walls. These are no accidents of style. They are part of a symphony, and tonight, you're listening to it from the inside. The ancient Persians weren't just dabbling when they invented the badger or windcatcher they were composing. These towers, which rise above the flat rooftops like elegant chimneys, are hollow on the inside and split into multiple channels. Each channel is angled to capture wind from a different direction. So even on a still day, or worse, a scorching one, with winds only strong enough to carry complaints, the badger found a way to catch something, redirect it, and push it inside. Here's the clever part. It didn't just suck in air like a vacuum cleaner on a warm setting. The air funneled down through the shaft, often across a pool of water or a series of clay bricks kept wet. This cooled the air through evaporation before it entered the living quarters below. The result, a cool breeze on your forehead while it's 108-degree feet are outside. No humming, no compressor. Just ancient science with a side of elegance. But how did they make it feel consistent, like the temperature never even moved? That's where geometry got involved. The shafts were angled not just for wind direction, but for velocity. A narrower passage meant faster airflow. And by splitting the air between multiple shafts and outlets, they could layer temperatures. Yes, layer them. Like a drafty Jenga tower with air-conditioned pockets. Historians still argue whether the Persians discovered this airflow layering by experimentation or whether it was a happy architectural accident, maybe a half-collapsed tower that by sheer luck cooled the pantry better than the rest of the house. Either way, it worked. The sensation was real. As you lean against a cold plaster wall inside this wind-cooled chamber, you notice the absence of sweat, even as the desert sun roars outside. You almost start to miss the suffering. Almost. And it wasn't just for comfort. Some suggest these windcatchers also preserved scrolls, perfumes, even medicines, anything that didn't like heat. Imagine a king's physician sneaking a poultice into a shaded alcove, mumbling, "No, no, this one absolutely melts above 80. A quirky tidbit for you, certain badger towers were designed not only to channel wind downward, but also to expel hot air upward when the wind died. The structure acted like a chimney pulling out the warm air from within. So if the wind was late to the party, the tower still had a backup plan, kind of like showing up without a fan, but still rocking an iced towel. You keep walking slowly through the hall, noticing how the cool air doesn't just rush, it drifts. Like it knows how tired you are. Like it's reading the room. There's a mural high on the wall, barely visible now, of dancing birds and flowering vines. But the paint has faded. Not from heat, though. These walls were always cool, always still. Time just moved on, brushing gently past the clay. One more strange thing, in some cities, these towers were decorated like jewelry. Blue tiles, sculpted ridges, even calligraphy that read more like poetry than blueprints. Function met beauty in a rooftop accessory that doubled as survival tech. Who said you can't look regal while fending off heat stroke? As you step into another room and feel a change in airflow, like a low sigh gliding past, you realize how complete the system was. Every chamber was cooled differently. A slight shift in temperature, air pressure, and light. It wasn't uniform, but it was intentional. You were meant to feel surprise, even in a palace where surprises were rare. So next time you grumble about the air conditioner being too loud or the fan wobbling like a nervous duck, just imagine a time when quiet breezes were built with bricks, clay, and dreams. And still, you probably wouldn't survive it. You step carefully barefoot across a tiled courtyard that glimmers from hours of sunbathing under the Persian sky. But now, your feet are drawn toward something colder, something hidden. Just beyond the edge of a shaded corridor, beneath a floor of carved stone, lies one of the secrets that kept ancient Persian palaces livable, the cistern. It doesn't look like much at first. A square opening tucked away in a shaded corner. But if you peer inside, you see darkness. Then maybe you hear the faint sound of water, echoing up from below as if the palace itself is exhaling. You descend slowly. The air thickens, cools. It smells faintly of wet stone and moss. You've arrived in the heart of the cooling system. Cisterns were more than just water storage. These underground reservoirs, sometimes called abi anbars, were built with thick insulation and sometimes lined with special materials like lime or ash to maintain the chill. Some had domed tops that helped reduce evaporation and trapped the cold air like an amphora in the sand. And here's where the Persian engineers got cheeky. They didn't just store water. They piped cool air from windcatchers across the cistern surface, and then sent that cooled breeze whooshing through the palace like an ancient version of central air. It worked like this. Imagine wind enters the tall Badger Tower above you. It rushes downward through angled vents and hits the water surface in the cistern. The air, already somewhat cooled by altitude loss, picks up moisture from the water below. Then, guided by a maze of narrow tunnels, it flows throughout the palace at just the right height to make the back of your neck say, "Ah." You probably won't survive designing one of these things today without a few engineering degrees or divine inspiration. Mainstream historians widely agree the cistern's role in climate control was pivotal, but there's still some debate about whether these subterranean spaces were also used for emergency storage during droughts or military sieges. Some sources even suggest that royal families kept ice blocks harvested from distant mountains inside these chambers wrapped in straw and burlap. That last bit, totally controversial. Ice in the desert. Sounds like a luxury flex, but archaeologists still argue whether there's solid proof. What's not up for debate is how you feel standing here. The walls sweat slightly. The temperature is a good 15-20 degrees cooler than outside, and there's a stillness that settles your heartbeat. You run your fingers over the curved brick ceiling, admiring how even underground architecture felt artistic. The cistern isn't just a utilitarian hole. It's been carefully designed, often ornamented with geometric plasterwork or even faint blue glaze. It reflects the Persian obsession with balance between form and function. Some cisterns, especially in the more opulent palaces, had separate chambers for water, meant for cooling versus drinking. This kept the airflow systems clean and avoided stagnant water smells wafting through royal bedrooms, which, let's be honest, could ruin even the nicest nap. Of course, someone had to maintain all this. That someone wasn't the king. Palace workers, often trained for generations, descended these steep steps carrying oil lamps and bundles of herbs, both to clear pests and to bless the water, or so they believed. One popular fringe theory suggests that certain cisterns were seen as sacred, connected to Anahita, the Persian goddess of water and fertility. Some even left offerings, coins, dried flowers, occasionally carved tokens. Think of it as the world's chillest wishing well. As you imagine the slow drip of water echoing through the chamber, you realize how much ancient luxury depended on silence. Not bustling, clanging machines, but soft murmurs of airflow, the trickle of cold water, and the stillness of buried stone. You sit at the edge of the cistern, now cross-legged like a visiting noble. The cool breath of the past brushes across your cheek, and up above the rest of the palace has no idea that their comfort is owed to this hidden whispering world beneath their feet. Now you're crouching low beside a pair of large bulbous clay jars, half buried in the shaded corner of a Persian courtyard. Their surfaces are damp, darkened by moisture, and the air around them feels just a little bit fresher than the rest. That's not a coincidence. These are zir pots, and they're doing something quietly magical using evaporation to make the unbearable just barely bearable. The basic idea is this water evaporates, which cools the surrounding area. That's it. But of course, leave it to the Persians to turn this backyard science fair project into an elegant, daily, life-enhancing miracle. The zir is made from 2 clay pots, one nestled snugly inside the other. Between them, wet sand. Inside the inner pot, perishables milk dates a suspiciously soft cheese. The outer pot gets soaked in water periodically, and as the moisture seeps through the porous clay, it evaporates into the dry desert air, drawing heat away with it. If you're thinking, wait, they had working refrigerators made of dirt. Yes, they did. You might be sipping on kombucha from a $300 smart fridge right now, but in the 6th century BCE, someone's great-great-great-grandmother was casually storing yogurt in the middle of the desert without electricity. And it wasn't just for food. Zir pots were sometimes placed near beds or in sleeping areas to gently lower the ambient temperature at night. You sweating under a woven blanket in a room with no AC might have loved a damp pot of sand beside your pillow, or not. There's still some debate among historians as to whether this technique worked consistently or was just something your uncle swore by after reading about it on a clay tablet. The truth is, very few of these pots have survived intact, but their cultural footprint lingers. Fragments have been found across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Iran, and they're still used today in parts of rural Sudan, Yemen, and even India, where they go by names like matka or coolgardi. Turns out, humans just keep reinventing the same tricks. Now, imagine it's dusk. You're sipping sweet pomegranate syrup from a bronze cup, and across the courtyard, a servant is placing a covered zir near the foot of your bed. You don't hear anything, just the soft lap of a breeze through the badger, and the tiny invisible hiss of water becoming vapor. If you lean close, the pot hums with coolness. What's even more delightful is how effortlessly sustainable this all was. No wires, no compressors, no ice deliveries, just air clay and the kind of patience you rarely find in modern life. It's like nature's own air conditioner, quiet, passive, slightly damp, and thoroughly unimpressed with your mini fan from Amazon. You may ask, why doesn't everyone use this today? Well, funny, you should ask. Some historians argue that zir pots only worked well in dry, arid conditions. Introduce high humidity like coastal cities or swampy valleys, and you're not cooling anything. You're just cultivating a very ambitious science experiment. And probably mold. Still, for desert-dwelling Persians, it was genius. Pair a few zirs with a shady courtyard, a qanat system piping in underground water, and a good windcatcher, and suddenly you've got a desert villa that's somehow chill. And no, you probably couldn't recreate this with your bathroom flower pots and a bag of playground sand. Unless you're ready for an entire summer of trial and error, suspicious odors, and your roommate asking why the fruit smells like wet bricks. But isn't it fun to imagine you reclining on a woven cot, clay jug at your elbow, soft cloth flapping in the door frame? Outside the desert groans with heat. Inside, the air sighs cool and damp like a breath from centuries past. You stand now near the threshold of a palace kitchen, but don't expect clanging pots or the smell of roasted lamb drifting on the air. Instead, what hits you is the thick, warm scent of earth and clay, mixed with something faintly sweet, maybe dried dates or rosewater syrup. You step inside, and the hush is remarkable. No fires roar, no smoke chokes the rafters. Just low murmurs and quiet footfalls. That's because in ancient Persia, keeping food hot was easy, keeping the cooks from fainting in the heat that took genius. This royal kitchen, like many from the Achaemenid and later Sasanian periods, was built partially underground or in deeply shaded alcoves. You see wide slabs of stone sunk into clay counters designed to absorb the day's coolness before sunrise and radiate it back by afternoon. Massive clay amphorae hug the walls, each one containing oil's grains or pickled treasures. But the real trick, they cook without flame, when they can help it. Remember, this is a palace that's already battling 100+ degrees Fahrenheit outside. Fire indoors. That's like lighting a match in a sauna. So instead, Persian kitchens used insulated braziers, clay pots with thick outer walls to trap heat and cook slowly. Picture your grandma's slow cooker, but made from baked earth and carried by a barefoot teenager in linen robes. The most impressive thing, though, is the sheer coordination. Servants work in shifts, rotating ingredients to outdoor ovens and bringing food back just partially cooked. Final steps, garnishing, cooling, plating happen in the kitchen's cooler belly. And the cold ingredients. They come from the zir pots you saw earlier, or the underground storage rooms cooled by the ever-singing qanats. Now, a quirky fact, some recipes called for burying hot pots under sand, letting the ambient desert heat finish the job. Yes, that's right, sand ovens. You'd stick your pot under 6 inches of earth and just wait sipping goat's milk until the stew said hello again. There's even archaeological evidence suggesting certain saffron-infused dishes were meant to infuse by ambient heat alone with 0 open flames. Historians still argue whether these kitchens used ceiling vents with wet cloths to filter the air, or if that's a later adaptation borrowed from Roman practices. Either way, moisture was key. You glance up, and sure enough, small holes carved high into the clay ceiling, some still ringed with faint residue. Someone long ago may have stood on a stool here, sprinkling rose water into the breeze, just to keep a breeze damp and bearable. And the kitchen staff. They weren't your run-of-the-mill workers. Many were trained in the art of Andar's moral instruction, which meant they knew not only when to stir the lentils, but also when to quote poetry. Imagine being scolded for over-seasoning rice. With a verse from Ferdowsi, your footsteps echo softly as you exit. No clang, no crash, no open flame, just the quiet hum of cleverness. You step through the heavy wooden doorway of a modest, noble home, modest, of course, by ancient Persian standards, which still means carved door frames, decorative tile work, and the scent of rose water lingering in the air. The moment you cross the threshold, the heat drops. Not dramatically, but just enough to make your shoulders ease and your breath slow. You blink at the dimness. It's like stepping into a cave, cool, hushed, and secretive. Now, look around. The walls here aren't thin or dainty. They're thick. Like really thick, often more than 3 feet deep, made of sun-dried mud bricks, and coated with bright white plaster that reflects sunlight. These walls are the ancient equivalent of your modern insulation, except without fiberglass or angry electricians. They absorbed the heat during the day, held it hostage, and only released it long after the sun had disappeared. You notice the windows, if you can even call them that. They're barely slits high up on the walls, strategically placed, to let in light, but not the blistering noonday glare. They act less like windows and more like light filters, which is a polite way of saying, no direct sun, thank you. And then there's the layout. Ancient Persian homes, especially in the arid Central Plateau cities like Yazd and Kashan, were built inward. The rooms surrounded a central courtyard, usually with a small pool or garden in the middle. The design wasn't just for Instagrammable aesthetics, though. Let's be honest, it would have crushed it. It was for passive cooling. Every part of the house was arranged to catch shade and redirect breeze. Some rooms even had seasonal roles. Summer rooms on the north side. Winter rooms tucked on the south. Historians still argue whether this layout was copied from older Mesopotamian models or if Persia developed it independently. Either way, it worked like a dream. Or at least like a ceiling fan powered by clever geometry. You run your hand along the wall and feel it cool, dense, a little chalky. And here's the fringe tidbit you probably weren't expecting in some households. Walls were embedded with small clay pipes, not for plumbing, but for air circulation. They didn't blast air like modern vents, but they whispered a breeze through the walls, basically the palace version of whispering sweet nothings, and you haven't even gotten to the rooftops yet. Climb the narrow clay steps, and you'll find flat roofs, where families slept during scorching summer nights. Picture it, rugs rolled out cushions strewn like sleepy clouds, and the night air brushing your face as gently as a story being told in the dark. No air conditioning, no bug spray, just stars and clay, and centuries of architectural wisdom. In fact, there's even archaeological evidence that some rooftops had low parapet walls to shield sleepers from strong winds and nosy neighbors. So, yes, ancient Persian bedrooms often came with a breeze and a view. The idea was simple, but genius. Keep the sun out, trap the cool in, and make every brick work over time. You wouldn't survive long hauling water or herding goats under the Persian sun. But inside these thick-walled, shy-windowed homes, you might just doze off mid-melon bite. And speaking of melons, do keep that in mind for later. You tilt your head upward and stare into the dusty gold light filtering through a high rounded dome. The ceiling above you doesn't just cap the room, it moves air like it has a mind of its own. You're standing in the central chamber of a Persian palace, one of many such marvels built centuries ago. And this ceiling isn't just for show. It's part of a choreography, a slow, deliberate ballet of heat and airflow that most modern buildings wouldn't dare attempt. You don't realize it right away, but something unusual is happening above your head. That dome, with its concentric rings and careful curvature, is subtly pulling the warm air up and out. It's a trick of physics and elegance. Warm air rises, cool air drops, and the dome vault and walls are whispering back and forth like quiet stagehands during a play. Domes weren't just symbolic or spiritual in Persian architecture, they were climate-control tools. The shape allowed heat to collect near the peak, leaving the air below cooler and more breathable. Some were capped with a small open vent, or even connected to the famed windcatchers, the badgers we met earlier, giving warm air a place to escape and encouraging cooler air to flow in. But there's more. In larger halls, you might also see squinches and muqarnas, architectural frills that seem decorative, but also create pockets and ledges where heat can gather, delaying its descent. A muqarna might look like an upside-down honeycomb carved from plaster, but it's actually a passive thermal trap. Historians still argue whether these flourishes were primarily aesthetic or functional, but many believe the airflow advantage was no accident. And when you step into adjacent rooms, you'll feel it again, those vaulted ceilings, those rounded chambers. Vaults served like gentle lungs in these buildings, guiding air with soft curves rather than sharp corners. Try whispering under one, and you'll hear your voice carried across the room in strange, smooth echoes. Now imagine that same dome doing the same thing to rising heat. There's a fringe theory, one you're allowed to enjoy, without necessarily believing that Persian architects deliberately placed scented plants and flowers beneath dome openings, so the rising air would carry soft aromas through the palace, like the world's slowest potpourri diffuser. No one's proven it, but hey, if you're going to invent air conditioning, you might as well make it smell good. As you walk slowly through these grand halls, it starts to feel like you're inside an enormous living creature, breathing, sighing, adjusting. You pause under a particularly tall dome, noticing how your own body feels just a little cooler than before. And that's no illusion. Even in the baking heat of midsummer Iran, these architectural choices could drop indoor temperatures by 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. No fans, no wires, just physics plaster and centuries of accumulated wisdom. Of course, nothing's perfect. When the dome got clogged with dust or pigeons decided to roost at the top, airflow could stall. That's when the maintenance folks came in, probably muttering in Old Persian about royal birds and windless halls. Still, even with occasional hiccups, these domes and vaults did something remarkable. They turned architecture into atmosphere. They transformed rooms into experiences using nothing but shape, sunlight, and space. As you keep moving through the palace, you'll begin to notice the subtle temperature shifts as you pass through domes of different sizes, each performing its own quiet trick for comfort. And somewhere high above you, a tiny puff of air drifts down like a sigh, reminding you that this palace isn't just built, it's breathing. By now you've grown used to the feel of sun-warmed bricks underfoot and the gentle sigh of shadowed corridors. The day has lingered long in the walled gardens of this Persian palace. But now the sky bruises with twilight and something shifts. The light softens. The air somehow tastes sweeter. You step into the royal gardens and everything suddenly feels, well, a little bit like magic. A musician plucks at a tar lute beneath a fig tree. Slaves sweating slightly less than usual, thanks to clever airflow channels cut into the walls, carry platters of sliced melon, chilled in clay zir pots. Nearby nobles recline on silk cushions, not fanning themselves frantically, but lounging, sipping diluted pomegranate wine and genuinely looking refreshed. How? Well, it turns out that 2,500 years before your modern rooftop air conditioner wheezed into life, Persian architects had already figured out how to host outdoor parties without the smell of burning wires or the hum of a condenser unit. The trick: location elevation and a little theatrical planning. First, you'll notice the garden isn't just a garden. It's a shahar bagh, a carefully laid out quadrilateral green space cut by 4 intersecting water channels. These canals aren't there just to look pretty, though they do shimmer rather nicely in the moonlight. They serve as both irrigation and passive cooling. The water absorbs daytime heat and releases cool air upward at night. It's a bit like air conditioning. If your AC unit was a gently babbling stream designed by a poet, above you hanging lanterns sway lazily in the night breeze. But look closer. Those breezes are no accident. They're coaxed by windcatchers, the tall chimney-like towers rising silently along the garden walls. Inside the towers, vertical shafts are angled precisely to channel the night wind downward. Some designs even include damp cloth hung inside the shaft, so that air as it passed was cooled through evaporation before it reached your sweat-prone royal forehead. And then, of course, there's the seating. You're not slumped on the ground like a peasant. Oh no. You're on a takt, a raised platform made of polished stone or brick, often built over a small qanat. Remember those magical desert plumbing tunnels from earlier? The cold air rises through cracks in the platform, and you unknowingly, brilliant as you are, reap the benefits of what historians call sub-floor cooling. Which brings us to a bit of a scholarly debate. Some experts argue that these takts were simply aesthetic part of the royal display of wealth and order. Others insist they served practical climate control purposes. Still others suggest rather dreamily that it was both comfort and beauty, entwined like jasmine vines on a trellis. And here's a quirky fact. Some Persian palaces were designed with garden roofs. That's right. Grass and fruit trees were planted directly atop arched brick ceilings. The soil and plants above acted like insulation, trapping cooler air inside while absorbing heat on top. And just like that, a roof wasn't just a roof. It was a whole eco-cooling system. Meanwhile, your host, perhaps a prince, or maybe just a well-connected noble, offers you candied rose petals and a smile. He gestures toward a shallow reflecting pool where the stars begin to shimmer. You wonder if it's the wine or the wind, but for the first time today, your skin isn't sticking to itself. Of course, it wasn't always seamless. Sometimes the breeze refused to show up. Sometimes the humidity made the cooling effect sluggish. And once in a while, a wandering goat might knock over a pot or two and send a minor cascade into someone's dinner plate. But all in all, these ancient partygoers knew something. We often forget when you design your world with the elements, not against them, cool comfort becomes part of the experience, not just a battle. And as a servant quietly rolls up a woven sunshade revealing a glimpse of the moonlit courtyard, you lean back and realize this isn't just passive cooling. It's passive luxury. So you slip down a narrow corridor, torchlight flickering softly against smooth clay walls. You're not part of the nobility tonight. No, tonight, you're in the sandals of one of the many unsung servants who kept this entire palace breathing. The main chambers may stay cool and sweet, but only because you and your fellow workers knew how to use shadow silence and some clever tunnel tricks to keep the system humming. You're hauling dates. Again, the path you're on. Not some majestic hallway. It's a service tunnel. It's dark, slightly damp, and has just enough headroom to avoid a concussion if you hunch slightly. These underground passageways weren't for style. They were ventilation marvels and labor lifelines. Here airflow wasn't just a luxury, it was survival. Above your head, the nobles sip sherbet under grapevine trellises, cooled by carefully calibrated breezes. But you and the other staff, you're moving through the underworld of the palace, where secret corridors linked the kitchen to the banquet hall, the cistern to the bathhouse, and the servant quarters to everywhere else. And these paths were cool, literally. Built below the clay floor, shaded from the sun, they were designed to stay comfortable even when the surface air made you consider melting into the tile. Some tunnels had ceramic piping embedded in the walls, channeling cooler air toward food storage chambers. Others were laid above qanat channels, so the air picked up moisture on the way in, making everything feel just a little less like you were standing in an oven. Historians still argue whether these systems were originally built for mobility or climate control first, but honestly, who says no to both? And then there were the hidden wall vents. You'd pass by what looked like a simple clay carving, and suddenly, a breath of air from nowhere. Some vents connected directly to tall windcatchers above, angled just so to siphon desert gusts and send them flowing through the palace's arteries. A kind of air conditioning, without buttons or bills. The truly mind-boggling part. You could walk from one side of the palace to the other, never stepping outside, and still remain cooler than the shade beneath a date palm. Servants even had special storage alcoves cut into clay walls to keep food fresh. Jars of milk, baskets of mulberries, bricks of cheese, each placed in a niche, where cross-ventilation made spoiling a little less inevitable. Oh, and speaking of cheese, one of your fellow servants is proudly carrying a wheel of goat cheese wrapped in fig leaves. You know for a fact he's hidden it behind a wall tile in the coldest spot in the whole tunnel. His personal stash. You don't tell. These tunnels weren't just clever. They were a kind of engineering language, an underground whisper that said, "We've been doing this for centuries." The same principles applied to bathhouses, too. You'd have warm rooms, yes, but always with cold transition spaces nearby. Need to escape the steam. Just duck through a small arch, and the air cools down like someone flipped a seasonal switch. As the day turns to night, you pause beneath a domed ceiling with tiny holes carved like constellations. A single shaft of moonlight spills into the tunnel. Somewhere above, the nobles are asleep. The palace is silent. But here in the quiet hum of earth and air, you find something rare in the desert, a moment that feels like breeze. And here's your quirky tidbit of our elite servants, often trained for years just to memorize airflow maps. No joke. There were designated air stewards whose job was to monitor windcatcher angles, adjust ceramic flaps, and ensure scent didn't travel the wrong way, because no one wants roast lamb aromas floating into the royal bath. And now you move on feet, light against cool tiles. Another tray to deliver. Another hidden corridor to slip through. Above you, a civilization sleeps soundly. But it only does so because the air is moving exactly where it should. You blink against the grit in your eyes. That breeze you've been enjoying for hours. It comes with a cost. Welcome to the less glamorous side of ancient Persian cooling maintenance. Specifically, the dusty, relentless battle against sandstorms. It begins with a low rumble in the distance. Maybe you're sipping pomegranate juice in the courtyard, when the light dims just a little. Then a faint orange haze thickens like someone smeared the sun with saffron paste. You know what's coming. A sandstorm. Not the cinematic monster storm kind that flips chariots, Just your average, highly annoying, airflow-ruining sandstorm. Windcatchers, those tall architectural miracles that normally brought in cool breezes, now become giant vacuums sucking in grit dust and small unfortunate insects. So before you can say air conditioning, your finely tuned natural ventilation system is huffing desert inside instead of out. It's like your ceiling fan went rogue and declared war on cleanliness. This is where the real heroes step in the royal maintenance staff. Not scholars, not poets, not generals. These are the barefoot, soot-smudged workers who climb narrow ladders inside windcatcher shafts to clear out debris patch cracks and clean the clay ducts with bundles of damp reed brushes. They don't get poems written about them. They do, however, get sunburns in places you didn't know could sunburn. Historians still argue whether the cleaning routines were done weekly, monthly, or only after major storms, depending on the region. But records suggest it wasn't a one-person job. Picture 3 to 5 men moving up and down like human pistons, keeping these desert lungs breathing. Then there's the sand itself. Fine beige and absolutely relentless. It creeps into everything. Into the reeds used to line the vents. Into the filters made from palm fibers. Into your soup, if you're not careful. And yes, into the cool underground cisterns, where it turns pristine water into beige broth. Engineers had to build clever filters just to slow it down. But the storm always wins a little. Over time, windcatchers wear down. Clay crumbles and mortar loosens. That's why the uppermost tiers of many towers had small wooden shutters, manual ones, so someone probably named something like Reza or Farid had to climb up and close them when a storm blew in. No automation here, just a dude, a rope, and hope. In Yazd and other cities, masons made a modest living just restoring these towers. If your windcatcher was broken, your home was an oven. Fixing it wasn't vanity, it was survival. Yet despite the constant erosion, these systems lasted decades. Some still stand today. They lean a little, they creak. But when the wind is just right, they whisper across time. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some travelers, European ones in the 17th century, mistook the windcatchers for religious monuments. One even wrote that they were sky fingers beckoning the divine, which sounds lovely. Until you realize they were basically giant medieval air ducts. And the debate continues. Were these structures repaired seasonally like clockwork? Or did wealthy households build 2 or more towers so one could rest while the other functioned? Archaeologists disagree. The only certainty cooling your palace with wind and clay meant a lifelong dance with dust. So tonight, as the imaginary sand brushes past your cheeks and the grit gathers on invisible marble, remember the folks climbing inside those towers. Not architects, not kings, just the quietly heroic team keeping the air clean, cool, and bearable. The sun dips low over the flat rooftops of Yazd, and your sandaled feet crunch lightly on the cracked stone path as you look up, way up. The skyline isn't dotted with minarets or cranes, but with tall, slender towers that look like inverted chimneys from a fantasy film. These aren't decorative. They're part of a subtle yet fierce arms race that once gripped ancient Persia. Welcome to the age of the windcatcher showdown. Cities like Yazd Kashan and Bam didn't just build for beauty or function, they built to outcool their neighbors. And yes, that's cool in the most literal sense. The taller your badger, your windcatcher, the better the draft. The breezier your halls, the more smug your dinner parties. You might not have had marble fountains or pet cheetahs, but if you had a 40-foot WAN tower and your cousin in the next town only had a 25-footer, you were winning. The race wasn't always about height. Sometimes it was the number of vents the shape of the crown, or clever internal engineering. Some towers had one big scoop facing the dominant wind direction. Others had four, like a tall, boxy crown, able to spin and trap any breeze from any angle. Persian engineers were whispering to the wind before we ever tried to harness it with a remote-controlled thermostat. Here's the real kicker: these bad gears often worked in harmony with subterranean systems like courtyards and cisterns. Air flowing over cold water intensified the cooling effect, sort of like air conditioning without the humming fan or shocking electric bill. And the best designs, they used temperature differentials inside the structure itself. Hot air would naturally rise and escape from vents, pulling cooler air in from shaded corridors. All without a single button press. Historians still debate exactly how much airflow could be produced by the tallest towers. Some claim they dropped interior temperatures by over 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Others argue that it depended entirely on humidity elevation and how recently someone had dusted the louvers. Academic disagreements in this field are, well, pretty chill, but still ongoing. And then there's the question of prestige. Some wealthy homeowners allegedly built taller windcatchers, not just for the cooling, but to show off their climate control superiority. Think of it like a medieval version of flaunting your fancy smart fridge with the Wi-Fi-enabled ice dispenser. Only here, the tower didn't just impress guests. It saved lives during brutal summer heat waves. Every brick was a message. Every tower a performance. Standing in the shadow of these soaring structures today, you can still feel their intent, silent, practical monuments to human stubbornness in the face of desert fire. But taller didn't always mean better. Maintenance became a dusty nightmare. Tower crowns cracked in desert winds, birds nested in vents, and sandstorms sometimes clogged the entire structure like a blocked sinus. Still, you pressed on because keeping a palace livable with nothing but baked mud and breeze was more than survival. It was Persian innovation at its breeziest. You stroll slowly now beneath one of the tallest preserved badgers, its clay surface glowing warm gold under the fading sun. A gentle hiss of wind whispers through slanted vents high above your head. And for a moment, you feel a shift in temperature, soft, perceptible. It's not air conditioning. It's not magic. It's clay and wind doing an ancient job they've done for thousands of years. And just wait until you learn about the subterranean sorcery that made it all possible. You're walking now along a cracked pathway that dips gently under the earth, where the dry heat of the Persian plateau gives way to something strange, a breath of damp coolness that brushes your cheek like a silk scarf soaked in spring water. There's no river nearby, no obvious well. Just this slope down into a shadowed tunnel carved through rock and gravel, quiet, forgotten, but once vital. You've just stepped into a connaught. Not many people think of plumbing as romantic, but this is desert sorcery, disguised as engineering. A connaught isn't just a ditch. It's a miracle carved with patience and math. These underground aqueducts, born in ancient Persia over 2,500 years ago, ferried water from high-altitude sources deep in the mountains where the snow melts slowly, year-round, and gently sloped it downward for miles beneath the baking earth until it surfaced in villages, palaces, and gardens far below. You follow the faint trickle of sound water gliding silently along a smooth, shadowed path. There's no pump, no clunky contraption, just gravity and geometry working together like the world's oldest duet. Here's how it worked in all its sleepy genius. A mother, well, sometimes 100 feet deep, was dug into the hillside to reach the underground water table. From there, a sloped tunnel stretched outward for miles, and every 50 feet or so, workers carved vertical shafts straight up to the surface, letting them remove debris and breathe fresh air while digging. When you peer up one of these today, it's just a circle of light against the void. But centuries ago, that shaft might have been filled with ropes, pulleys, and dusty forearms hauling out dirt by the bucketful. Now here's the amazing part. These qanats cooled the air above them. How remember our old friend, the windcatcher. In the fancier palaces, a wind tower would suck in hot desert air and direct it down into a qanat tunnel. The air brushing past the cold water below lost its heat and moisture before being pushed up into the home like nature's own air conditioner. No clattering fan, no electric hum, just airflow and patience. Historians still debate just how advanced these systems became. Some believe elite estates used filters and narrow sluices to cool not only rooms, but food storage areas and bathhouses, creating a kind of cool district within the complex. Others argue that we may be projecting modern dreams onto what was mostly practical plumbing. Either way, the effect remains oddly mesmerizing and very real. And yes, before you ask, some qanats are still in use today. In Iran, Afghanistan, and parts of North Africa, these underground veins of life still deliver water the same way they did before Rome ever built an aqueduct. In fact, modern engineers have studied them with open notebooks and quiet awe, trying to recreate sustainable water systems for parched cities of the future. You can imagine a soft-spoken architect in a linen shirt muttering, "Wait, they figured this out that long ago," and then quietly deleting their air conditioning sketch. You pause by the flow now. It's barely a whisper, that little stream, but it runs deep, fed by a logic so old that the earth itself seems to approve. Overhead, the sun is a distant threat, unable to reach you here. You could sit for hours just breathing, listening, and you wonder how many feet over how many centuries have stood here. Caravans of silk traders washing dust from their ankles, palace couriers ducking through the shaft to avoid the midday blaze, maybe a young servant sneaking a cool sip during a break, feeling for the first time that rare and slippery feeling relief. The breeze that finds its way into this tunnel is slow-moving and honest. No artificial chill, just desert air that's been softened by earth and time. And somewhere up there in the palace, a noble is sipping pomegranate wine in a shaded room, completely unaware that their comfort depends on this ancient tunnel and the men who dug it one careful foot at a time. You're standing near the edge of what used to be a majestic courtyard in Yazd, or maybe Bam, where once the warm wind whispered through latticed windows and caught on windcatchers that rose like sails over the skyline. But now, the clay is crumbling. The air is still, and the breeze, once tamed by clever minds and fired bricks, has forgotten its way home. You notice something strange as you trace your hand across a weather-worn wall. The faint impression of a vent, half buried by time and desert sand, still clings to the plaster. It's a reminder of a knowledge that's quietly slipped out of our hands. As modern glass towers hum with air conditioners and churn fossil fuels by the ton, these ancient wind-catchers badgers stand like forgotten sages, patiently watching the world forget what it once knew so well. The decline of passive cooling in Persian architecture wasn't sudden. It drifted in quietly, like a dusty breeze through an unattended archway. In the 20th century, as oil money gushed and modernity spread across the Middle East, new buildings promised comfort through electricity, quick, loud, and measurable. Old techniques were labeled backward, even though they had kept people cool for thousands of years with zero carbon footprint. You hear the thrum of an AC unit in your mind now just for comparison. In contrast, that clay dome you're imagining, thick, porous, sunbaked, sat like a slow, thoughtful whisper against the sun's roar. It cooled you with patience, not power. Historians still argue whether this shift was truly inevitable. Some blame colonial influence. Others point to globalization's pull, where concrete and glass became symbols of wealth and real progress. A few even wonder whether the architects themselves lost confidence in their own traditions, seduced by thermostats and ducts, instead of trusting the rhythms of earth, wind, and shadow. But not everyone forgot. Some towns like Yazd fought to preserve their vernacular wisdom. In recent decades, there's even been a revival of interest architects peeking back over their shoulders and sketching out windcatchers on digital tablets, hoping to retrofit skyscrapers with ancient lungs. A fringe but fascinating theory floats around in architectural circles, that future Martian habitats might use Persian cooling methods, because electricity will be scarce, but clay and wind, those may be all we have. Imagine that your great-great-great-grandchild living in a red dust dome cooled by designs from 2,500 years ago. Wild right. Back in your imagined courtyard, the shadows have stretched longer. You watch a swirl of sand ghost through a doorway. It hesitates, then vanishes. The windcatcher above it groans softly, like it remembers something. Something lost, but not entirely gone. Because that's the truth about architecture made from wind and clay. It may decay, but it never truly disappears. Not when the blueprints are embedded in memory and in bricks that still hum faintly with the music of a forgotten breeze. You pause at the edge of what used to be a grand palace, now just a crescent of broken walls, half-sunken archways, and the memory of a roof. The clay beneath your sandals still holds the sun's heat. But there's a breeze, just the faintest movement of dry air, winding through jagged corridors like a ghost that refuses to leave. Here in this hushed corner of southern Iran, the silence is broken only by that low whisper of wind. It dances between old bricks, stirs a wisp of dust, nudges past a broken window that hasn't held glass for centuries. Once this breeze would have been guided by hands that knew exactly where to carve stone and where to curve clay. Now it flows wherever it wants, directionless, but not uninvited. You find what's left of a windcatcher tower, tall, narrow, cracked in half, like a broken flute. Still, even now, it manages to tug a thread of coolness from the heavy air. Not enough to chill your spine, but enough to make you wonder, how did they do it? Historians still argue whether this was simply intuition, decades of trial and error, or some lost text of engineering wisdom we've yet to rediscover. Maybe it was all three. Maybe it was just living close enough to the desert to truly listen to it. Somewhere nearby, the remnants of a qanat trickle in silence. You can't see it, but the faintest drop echo reaches your ears, rhythmic like breath. The water still flows, even if no one drinks from it anymore. And the clay still cools, even if no one sleeps here. These walls remember, and if you're quiet, really quiet, they might let you borrow a few forgotten degrees of comfort. You lean against a sun-warmed pillar, The air doesn't move fast, but it moves. And now, the breeze softens even more. You hear less and feel more the pressure of the clay around you, the faintest cool rising through stone that remembers how to care for tired bodies. Everything here was built to hold space for heat and to let it go again. So let go too. Let the windcatchers above you sway in memory. Let the sky dim to that perfect shade of end-of-day blue. Let your breath settle into the same rhythm the connets keep far underground, always flowing, never rushing. Maybe you're not in a ruined palace at all. Maybe you're still curled up beneath your blanket, the fan humming gently overhead, your phone screen dimming out just as your eyes drift closed. The ancients worked with wind and water and the curve of domes. You're working with rest, and you're doing just fine.